Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the final session of this two-day conference. Our conference is titled The Middle East, Knowledge and Power in the Middle East, Regional and International Perspectives. My name is Dana Olwan, and I have the distinct pleasure today of chairing this important panel on Palestine. Our panel's title is Knowledge and Power in Palestine, the Quest for Statehood and the Marginalization of Rights. I want to start by thanking Dr. Hassan Hakamian, the Director of the Middle East Studies Program, for his work in organizing this conference and this panel. And before I start with introducing my colleagues, I'd like to just attend to a couple of housekeeping matters. First, on the slides, you will see our Twitter handles. So if you'd like to tweet about this conference or the presentations on this panel, please feel free to utilize our names and titles over there, which are listed on the presentation. As well, we are providing translation. You may download the app in order to access the translation services, which are available to everybody. And lastly, in terms of questions, if you'd like to post any questions, we'll be able to see them. Please post them in the chat. We will be dealing and addressing your questions towards the end of the presentations. And lastly, regarding changing of the view, please follow the instructions that are posted on the presentations. Today's panel addresses the question of Palestine and focuses in particular on issues of self-determination, sovereignty, and the question of rights. This panel addresses this topic from a decidedly decolonial or anti-colonial perspective that pushes against the dominant framework of the two-state model. Our speakers today come from a variety of interdisciplinary perspectives, and I feel very fortunate to be able to introduce them and chair this panel today. So I will introduce them in the order in which they will speak, and then I will hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Samia Al-Botmeh, who will be moderating the chat and also responding to the panelists. So the first speaker for today is Dr. Leila Farsakh, who is Chair and Associate Professor of Political Science at the College of Liberal Arts at UMass Boston. She is the author of the recently published book, Rethinking Statehood in Palestine, Self-Determination Beyond Partition, which has just been published by the University of California Press. Our second speaker for today is Dr. Hanieh, who is the Professor of Political Economy and Global Development at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. He is the author of Money, Markets, and Monarchies, the Gulf Cooperation Council and the Political Economy of the Contemporary Middle East from Cambridge Press in 2018. Our final speaker is Dr. Suzanne Akram, who is Clinical Professor of Law at Boston University. Her research and publications focus on immigration, asylum, refugee, forced migrations, and human and civil rights issues, with a particular interest on the Middle East, the Arab and Muslim world. This panel will be generously and kindly moderated by Dr. Samia Al-Botmeh, who is Dean of the Faculty of Business and Economics of Birzeit University. Her research focuses on alternatives to neoliberal development in the West Bank and Gaza and gender differentials in the labor market outcomes. Thank you to all the panelists, and I look forward to learning from your work.
Thank you very much, Dana, and thank you all for this wonderful opportunity to be able to talk about these very important issues that are close to our heart and are central also to concerns about how far statehood can liberate rather than oppress or vice versa. The aim of my presentation today is really to examine Palestinian attempt to fulfill their right to self-determination through the creation of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. As you all know, the quest for a sovereign state has been at the center of the Palestinian national struggle for a very long time. Ever since the PLO defined its goal in 1971, the establishment of a democratic state inclusive of Muslim, Jews, and Christians in Palestine, free from Zionist imperialism. However, the continuous attack on the Palestinians in the 70s and 80s and the inability to defeat Zionism has led the PLO to accept the international consensus on the two-state solution as the only one available to fulfill Palestinian rights. In 1988, the PLO chairman at the time, Yasser Arafat, officially recognized Israel, and the Palestinian National Council issued the Palestinian Declaration of Independence. This paved the way for the Oslo peace process in 1993 and implied that the Palestinian state was to be confined in the West Bank and Gaza. By 2022, the state of Palestine is officially recognized by 138 states globally and is admitted into the United Nations as a non-member state. state, though, as you all know, is still under occupation and is far from being sovereign or capable of protecting Palestinian rights. As many have argued, the peace process and the two-state solution reformulated rather than ended Zionist colonialization. They undermine the possibility of a viable Palestinian state. Israel's continuous war and siege on Gaza, the presence of over 650,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank, half of which moved after 1993, the 703-kilometer separation wall that is encroaching on Palestinian land in the West Bank, and the 99 Israeli checkpoints have destroyed any possibility for a viable Palestinian state. And yet, the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, the international community, and the regional powers still are committed to the Palestinian statehood. The Arab Peace Initiative and the internationally endorsed roadmap of 2008 considered the establishment of a Palestinian state not only a right, but also the only means to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So what I will try to do today, and what the book that Dana mentioned tries to do, is pose two questions and try to find an answer to them. First, why is this attachment to the Palestinian state when this state failed to meet Palestinian needs and rights? This state excludes the refugees, exclude the Palestinian citizens of Israel, have fragmented the Palestinian nation, and has compromised also the political rights of those living in the West Bank and Gaza, given the authoritarianism and the corruption of the Palestinian Authority. Secondly, it examined what alternatives are there to the Palestinian state project. Here, the aim is to analyze the opportunities and costs in moving away from the pursuit of territorial sovereignty as a means to achieve political liberation. So the question is the extent to which the Palestinian cause can survive without a state. And I argue basically that the failure of the Palestinian state does not mean that the Palestinian cause is lost, actually it's present, but rather, or that we can transcend the state. Rather, what it calls for us is to re-articulate the relationship between self-determination and decolonization, away from the two-state solution and the partition paradigm that has dominated all international attempts to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and protect Palestinian rights. So with regards to the first question, why is there still attachment to the Palestinian state despite its failure to meet Palestinian needs or protect the minimum of their rights? On the one hand, there is the realist argument, the realpolitik argument. Many argue that given the international recognition of the Palestinian right to statehood, why give it up? Many further maintain that given the international consensus on the two-state solution, the reality of Israel's power militarily and economically, its regional integration increasingly, makes the Palestinian state the only option available. For these realists, the issue is how to reform the Palestinian Authority, not how to destroy the Palestinian state project. To this argument, though, it is necessary to explore the political economy of the Palestinian state project, something that Adam Hanieh here on our panel will go into. In other words, to understand why we're still talking about a Palestinian state and there is still attachment to a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza despite its failures, we need to understand who stands to gain and lose from such a project, not only at the level of the Palestinians, but also regionally and globally. On the other hand, I argue the reason why we remain attached to a Palestinian state lies in the fact that it affirms Palestinian right to self-determination, and thus their political presence in an international system that negated their presence, especially an any peace settlement such as UN Resolution 2, that provided the base for all negotiation and recognition of the Palestinians. This might seem trivial today, but in the 1970s and 80s, it was not an easy matter. The problem, though, in other words, the international recognition of the Palestinian state, even within the framework of the Oslo peace process and partition, affirmed the Palestinian rights to have rights, as to quote it. In other words, it was a necessary, if not sufficient step, to fulfill Palestinian right to citizenship, return, and equality in a world that is based on the sovereignty of nation states. However, as we explained, such a state could not deliver independence or sovereignty. And why? For two main reasons. One, because it was part of a peace process based on partition, rather than on concept of international law, and on an understanding of self-determination that is limited to a Westphalian understanding of sovereignty, one that acquiesces to realpolitik consideration rather than that is based on concept of justice, equality, and an international law that seeks to make this world a more just one, rather than one that acquiesces to ongoing imperial structures of domination. Secondly, the reason why the Palestinian state failed is because it accepted Zionism rather than deal with it as a fact of colonialism and colonialism as a crime, as UN Resolution 1514 of 1974 1961 called it. This resolution declared all form of colonialism a crime, and Zionism is a form of colonialism. And what happened with the state project accepted to abstract the issue of Zionism from the equation, and thereby did not embark on trying to decolonize the ongoing reality. The question then thus becomes, should this state that is created on the basis of a colonial structure that is dependent on colonial structures of domination, should it be rejected? And can the Palestinian cause survive without having a state? Undoubtedly, the Palestinian cause exists without the Palestinian state. The Palestinian nation is strong and alive. It's a struggle for justice and equality and rights. The right of return is well protected by international law to us. And the Palestinian cause concerns those living in the West Bank and Gaza, as well as those living outside of Palestine. The question is, though, the debate about the Palestinian nation being larger or more important than the state, in my view, does not solve the problem of how to tackle the ongoing reality of settler colonialism and how to protect Palestinian rights living outside the boundaries of Palestine. In my view, the question is not whether the state should be transcended or not, rather how or what kind of state or legal structure is needed to end Palestinian dispossession and decolonize the ongoing Palestinian reality. So how is that possible? What kind of knowledge and power are needed to decolonize the present reality, to go beyond the partition paradigm that allowed this colonial structure to persist? Here, of course, we know there's lots of debate on that we need to transform the one-state reality that Israel created into a one-state just solution. There's lots of debate going on the merits and limits of the one-state solution, whether Palestinians should adopt a binational state or formulate the one democratic state slogan of 1971. The book also addresses many of these questions. But what I would like to do in the 5 minutes that are remaining for me is rather to focus on identifying the key challenges that we need to confront as Palestinians and as citizens of the world committed to justice in any attempt to transform the ongoing one-state reality or apartheid structure into a state that ensures Palestinian rights. And here I feel that we face 5 main challenges that need to be addressed. First, we need to re-articulate the relationship between the nation and the state. We understand the nation as a more inclusive term. The nation state has proved to be a very restrictive and exclusionary entity. What needs to happen is, I think, we need to reclaim the state as a juridical legal order, which is responsible and accountable to citizens and to international law. That's the first. Secondly, we also need to define the nation in juridical or legal terms rather than in ethnic terms. Again, my colleague Susan Akram will tell us more about it. Tells us that international law affirms the existence of a Palestinian nationality, but not of a Jewish nationality. How can we reclaim this legal right and work on it to articulate a more legally juridical democratic state will be very important. Secondly, we need to re-articulate the meaning of decolonization. We want to decolonize Palestine. This does not mean that we just need to decolonize the land, but we also need to decolonize relationship. Colonial relationships need to be decolonized because decolonization is a process and not an end in itself. It's not a thing. And this, of course, decolonizing relationship means that we need to be involved in a process of internal decolonization, as Fanon reminded us, as well as decolonize power relationship. Again, law has a role to play in this regard, just as our intentionality and the role for discussing transitional justice. Thirdly, I think one of the difficult things in talking about the one-state solution is that we needed any one-state solution to discuss the issue of the right of those who are not Palestinians. This means that we need to address the question of Israelis and how to decolonize Israel without depriving Jews of their political rights as being equal to Muslims and Christians. Yet this question, the question of the right of others, pertains not just to the Palestinians. It pertains to the whole Middle East region. It pertains to everybody living in the Middle East, whether in Syria or Bahrain, Iran or Iraq. It's about how we're going to treat Shia and Sunni equal, how we're going to treat Muslim and non-Muslim with equal political rights rather than based on ethnic or religious right. Fourthly, we need to define a new political will and strategy for moving forward. In this regard, there has been a lot of debate among the Palestinians about the need to revive the PLO, to create a new structure of representation to present new forces away from just Fatah and Hamas, and to define a political strategy that can articulate the meaning of decolonization, affirm the indigeneity of the Palestinian people, and show how indigeneity and decolonization is compatible with equality for all. This again brings us back to the fact that we cannot transcend the state, but we need to redefine its role and limit to make it accountable to everybody. Very much, and I look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you, Leila. Adam, do you want to go ahead?
Okay, thank you. I would like to just begin by saying thank you to the organizers and my fellow panelists. It's a really great pleasure to be part of this workshop today, to see some old friends and also to discuss, I think, some of the really important ideas that Leila has brought together in this book that we are contributed to, each of us on the panel. As Leila pointed out in her presentation now, the question of state formation in Palestine has attracted a lot of attention from scholars and activists alike since the establishment of the Palestinian Authority in 1994. In my presentation today, I want to look at some of the contributions I make in my chapter in this book, and I focus here on several aspects to this debate around state formation. Firstly, I try to highlight that much of the debate around state formation in the literature has focused around three particular questions. That is the relationship between peace and state formation, in particular between the Oslo Accords and the international intervention in the West Bank and Gaza and the processes of state formation. Secondly, much of the debate in the literature has focused on the priorities and nature of the Palestinian Authority and its character of its institution building in the West Bank in particular. And thirdly, there's been a lot of writing on the linkages between donor funding and the emerging features of Palestinian government. Now, given the nature of the Oslo Accords and the subsequent negotiations between Israel and the PLO, the discourse surrounding these debates has tended to be almost exclusively around some version of a two-state solution, as Leila has pointed out, typically with greater attention given to the West Bank as the spatial center of the Palestinian Authority and its institution building. What I try to do in my chapter is to say that this is problematic and argue that this focus on state formation, where we narrow the question to the issue of or the territory of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, particularly the West Bank, as a self-contained social formation, is problematic. And instead, what we need to do is broaden our understanding of state building in Palestine and the character of the Palestinian Authority to place more emphasis on the political economy of the regional scale being the Middle East and the dynamics of the Middle East over the last few decades, particularly since the signing of the Oslo Accords. So what I try to do in my chapter is draw out some of the trends that have occurred at this regional scale over the last few decades and ask what this might mean for how we think about state formation in Palestine, in particular the character of the Palestinian Authority. So I want to present in my comments today a summary of this argument and the impact of these regional dynamics. So there are, I think, two clear, or an important place to start with this is to look at the place of the Middle East, or the place of the region within the world market, and particularly within global capitalism. This, of course, is closely related to the importance of oil and gas, which arose in the post-World War II era. Oil and gas coming to underpin that fueled industry, transportation and military networks, new forms of commodity production, as well as financial markets. Now, this rising importance of the region to the way that the world market was structured had a great deal of implications for the United States in particular, as the major dominant power coming out of World War II. And as is well known, this meant that the United States placed a great deal of emphasis on controlling the Middle East region, in particular building alliances through the 1950s and 1960s with Saudi Arabia on one side, Israel on the other, and at that moment, Iran as the other major ally of the United States in the immediate post-war era. Now, within this, Israel played a particularly important role as a settler colonial state, and particularly after 1968 and the defeat of Arab nationalism and the Arab anti-colonial struggles of that decade. The United States built a very strong relationship with Israel alongside the Gulf states as its main allies in the region. Now, what this meant through that period is that the United States sought to lessen the boycott that was placed upon Israel by other Arab states, and to integrate more fully Israel into the regional economy, to seek and develop closer political and economic ties between, on one side, Israel, on the other side, the Gulf states in the region. Through the 1990s and 2000s, this was articulated under the concept of the so-called New Middle East, under which the United States sought to tie together different regions, Israel and the Gulf and other Arab states, within a single economic zone, and to encourage the Arab states to drop their boycotts of Israel, and to develop joint investments and other economic projects between Israel and the region. The normalization of Israel's ties with the Arab states thus became a central focus of US policy in the Middle East through the 1990s and 2000s. In this respect, the Oslo Accords of the 1990s and onwards were a very crucial feature of integrating Israel into the region's political economy. Most significantly, Oslo was an attempt to provide a Palestinian green light for Arab normalization with Israel. And I think many of the points that we heard in the first presentation point to this, point to the role of Oslo in normalizing Israel's position in the wider region. Now, what you might ask, has this got to do with the character of, or how we understand Palestinian state formation? And I think there's an aspect to this that's really key. That is to understand the way that Gulf businesses and the Gulf states also expanded across the region through the 1990s and 2000s, including into the Palestinian economy. In fact, through the period 2003 to 2008, more than 2/3 of total global foreign direct investment in Palestinian Authority areas in the West Bank actually originated from the Gulf region. Now, these figures are a tiny proportion of total Gulf foreign direct investment in the whole of the Middle East, but for the small Palestinian economy, they are substantial. It is, I think, really important to understand the way that economic policy and economic development in particularly in the West Bank was linked to these financial flows that came from the Gulf through the 2000s. There is, however, another aspect to this regional expansion of Gulf capital that goes beyond the simple flow of foreign direct investment. And this, I think, is a really crucial aspect to understanding the nature of Palestinian state formation. That is, that many of the big business groups in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, diaspora Palestinian businesses who are headquartered or largely based in the Gulf as well as Jordan. The return of diaspora Palestinian capital through the 1990s, I think, is a really crucial aspect of understanding how the Palestinian Authority, how the nature of Palestinian state formation was tied to this wider reconfiguration of the region through the early 2000s. Now, there's a range of examples of this. We can see, for example, the Al-Masri and the Khoury family groups, business groups, who both are quite dominant in the West Bank economy in particular, but also actually locate their main source of accumulation or base of accumulation in the Gulf states. These big diaspora capital groups were linked to early state formation in the Gulf through the establishment of companies involved in the laying of pipelines, through engineering, through construction, and through the provision of service to the Gulf's oil and gas industries. And since that time, the companies founded by these family groups have expanded across the Middle East, including returning to Palestine. Now, I think this is important because these cross-border capital flows link the diaspora and local Palestinian political economy and have meant that the Palestinian economy in the West Bank, particularly at the top tiers, have come to be dominated by Palestinian Gulf-based capital and business groups. This is true in the case of banking, in finance. It's true in the case of telecommunications. It's true in the case of many of the development funds that are active in the PA areas. And in my chapter, I try to look at some of these relationships in real estate, manufacturing, transport, retail, energy, and so forth. Now, why I think this is important is that this configuration of class and state, looking at how these regional ties extend across the Middle East, linking the Gulf and the Palestinian Authority and business in the Palestinian areas, helps to clarify the social forces that underlie the Palestinian Authority and also its relationship to the Israeli occupation. And I think what we can see is that the social class embodied by these large conglomerates remain both closely connected to power structures in the Gulf as well as the normalization project with Israel itself. So just to end and ask what conclusions might we draw. The first thing is, I think we cannot approach the question of state formation in the abstract. as it is in much of the literature. In other words, just simply as a technocratic question of institutional forms around authority, legitimacy, and capacity, for example. Instead, we need to look at the way that the character of the state in the West Bank and Gaza Strip is reflective of social and power structures that extend beyond the borders of Palestine into the wider Middle East region. And looking at this, I think we can perhaps look at some of the questions that Leila raised in a different kind of way, assessing the social forces that underpin the Palestinian Authority and what other alternative kinds of state formation might emerge. Secondly, and my chapter was written largely prior to the Abraham Accords and the normalization between the UAE and Israel and other Gulf states. But I think that project really highlights again the importance of situating the PA within these wider regional processes. It really is, I think, important to understand how this process of normalization that the Abraham Accords embodies was not simply something that came with Trump, but actually was something that began much earlier and has been a long-term strategic orientation of the United States in the region. So I think really taking, if you like, this regional lens is a really essential element of thinking through possible paths of state formation or alternative paths to state formation in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Before Susan sets off, I just want to remind everyone that you may start posting your questions in the question and answer box on your screen towards the downside, the right-hand side of the screen. We will engage, of course, with these after our third speaker has concluded. You may go ahead, Susan.
Thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this panel. My research has focused on comparing the legal perspectives on Jewish as opposed to Palestinian nationality in terms of the rights that those trigger for claims to the territory. I'm going to be speaking about the significance of understanding Palestinian nationality and its connection to the right of Palestinian return independent of statehood. It's important at the outset to define the meaning of the terms citizen and national. They're often used interchangeably, but they have distinct meanings. Nationality has both a legal and sociological meaning, but it's most commonly understood as referring to a particular group with common ethnic or cultural origins, Bosnians or Serbs, Kurds, Tamils, or Armenians, regardless of the territory in which they're located. The legal meaning, however, is quite different and refers to the relationship as defined by law between an individual and a particular state or territory. From the legal perspective, the ethno-religious national identity of a person is irrelevant. It is the connection the person has to a particular state or territory, that is, his membership in it, which defines his legal nationality. The term citizen, on the other hand, relates to the domestic law of states. A state can determine through its internal laws which among its residents have the preferred status of citizenship with the privileges and benefits afforded by that status. Now, the legal source of Palestinian nationality begins with the Ottoman Empire. Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire until 1923, and on 6 August 1924, under the terms of the Lausanne Treaty, Ottoman citizens who resided in the territory of Palestine became Palestinian citizens. As a matter of international law, Palestinian nationality was formed on this date. Following the Lausanne Treaty, each of the former Ottoman territories, including Palestine, had a citizenship law that codified their nationality statuses. During the League of Nations period, Palestinian citizenship was codified by British law, the Palestine Citizenship Order of 1925. The Palestine Citizenship Order afforded Palestinian citizenship to all those who were Turkish Ottoman subjects or citizens at the time of the Lausanne Treaty and were habitually resident in Palestine. The population meeting this criteria numbered 847,000 people. Aside from the complication of the British Mandate itself and the inclusion of the Balfour Declaration in it, the recognition and codification of Palestinian nationality was consistent with international law. It attached to a population that was genuinely and intrinsically linked to a defined territory with specified borders and passed through blood, residence, or birth on the territory. It was also consistent with the customary law rule that inhabitants found on a territory when there's a change of sovereignty should automatically acquire the nationality of the successor state. Under the British citizenship law, Palestinians could obtain passports, and well over 70,000 Palestine passports were issued. By 1901, as you all know, the World Zionist Organization had established the Jewish National Fund to purchase land for Jewish settlers in Palestine, as well as in other areas in the Middle East and Africa. Zionists succeeded in aligning their plan of redeeming the land for Jews with British interests in the Middle East, and in 1917, the British cabinet endorsed a letter known as the Balfour Declaration, which said that it viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Although the Zionists interpreted the endorsement of this declaration as a British commitment to the Jewish people for the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine, there are serious deficiencies in this interpretation. Britain had no legal authority to create any political entity in Palestine that disregarded the rights of the indigenous Palestinian population. Moreover, the Balfour Declaration was not approved by the British government. It was defeated in both houses when put to parliamentary vote. As a matter of international law, the Balfour Declaration must be understood as Britain providing for Jews a home in Palestine, but not a Jewish homeland, and certainly not a Jewish state. Nothing in the historical or legal history gives support for a claim that the Balfour Declaration recognized Jewish nationality attached to a distinct population of individuals entitled to self-determination in Palestine. Now, the next major legal historical development relevant to the question of Palestinian nationality was the passage of Resolution 181, the Partition Plan, on 29 November 1947. First, it's important to note that 181 was a General Assembly resolution, and under the UN Charter, the General Assembly has no authority to divide territory. Recognizing this, the Security Council and Britain, the mandatory power, refused to endorse the partition plan, and the UN Secretariat's own interpretation of Resolution 181 was that it had no obligatory character whatsoever. Second, it's important to understand the actual provisions of 181. Jews who were given citizenship during the mandate were those actually residing in Palestine, not outside. 181's recognition of a Jewish and an Arab state did refer to religious and racial criteria, but referred to them as the two peoples of Palestine. The plan's principle was that Palestinian citizens, regardless of their religion, residing in the Arab state would become citizens of that Arab state. Palestinian citizens residing in the Jewish state, regardless of their religion, would become citizens of the Jewish state. Moreover, the population demographics on which the partition plan was based excluded the Arab Bedouins. The British Palestine authorities telegrammed this serious omission to the British Foreign Office, saying the immediately striking feature of the plan is that on the committee's own figures, including 90,000 Bedouin, the Jewish state would contain more Arabs than Jews. Finally, the resolution required a one-year period prior to independence of either state under the supervision of a UN commission, during which time both states had to incorporate constitutions that provided for equal rights for all citizens without discrimination. The partition plan, then, did not authorize either state to institutionalize superior rights for any religious or racial group. It preserved Palestinian nationality stemming from the Lausanne Treaty and included Jews habitually resident in Palestine eligible for Palestinian citizenship living on the territory. This conclusion is confirmed by the UN's view through Resolution 194. Resolution 194's reference to refugees also relates directly to the UN's view of Palestinian nationality in 1948. In passing Resolution 194 of 11 December of that year, the General Assembly established the United Nations Conciliation Commission on Palestine, with a broad mandate to resolve both the conflict and the massive refugee problem, define the persons for whom the UNCCP would provide international protection, and in 1943 paragraph 11 sets out a legal formula for resolving the refugee problem. Although there's no clear definition of Palestine refugee incorporated in the language of Resolution 194, the drafting history clarifies exactly which people were defined by the term. The UNCCP and its legal advisors' interpretations of paragraph 11 state that the term refugees applies to all persons, Arabs, Jews, and others who have been displaced from their homes in Palestine. These make clear that the UN drafters were defining Palestine refugee as referring to the entire group of persons covered by the Palestinian Nationality Citizenship laws of 1925, emanating from the Lausanne Treaty. These were all habitual residents and citizens of Palestine, as well as their descendants. Today, such persons would number over 11 million Palestinians worldwide. Although Israel's declaration of its state claimed that the state would guarantee equal rights to all its citizens without discrimination, shortly afterwards, Israel passed a series of laws that affected the rights and interests of Palestinians to their property and permanently affected their legal connection to their homeland, including 2 separate laws on nationality citizenship. Under Israel's 1950 law of return, immigration to Israel is exclusively reserved for Jews. All Jews are automatically Jewish nationals and part of the Israeli state. No connection, it's important to note, to the territory is required under this law, other than to be Jewish. Under Israel's 1952 nationality law, there are 4 methods for obtaining Israel nationality: return for Jews only under the 1950 law, residence in Israel, birth, or naturalization. Now, this law also retroactively repealed Palestinian citizenship under the Palestinian Citizenship Order of 1925 to the date that Israel was declared a state. Under this law, all Palestinians who could not meet the requirements for obtaining Israeli nationality became stateless under Israeli law, which has been confirmed by the majority of decisions of Israeli courts. Under the law, Palestinians could become Israel nationals, but only if they met stringent conditions, which none of the 750,000 refugees were able to satisfy. Many Palestinians remaining in the territory were also unable to satisfy the conditions if they left their homes or the territory, which became Israel at any time before the law was passed, or were unable to meet the registration requirements. So what about Palestinian versus Jewish nationality? What is little understood about the Israeli nationality law is that it creates a legal fiction. There's no such thing as Israeli nationality, as the Israeli High Court itself has confirmed. The only nationality to which rights and privileges are attached is Jewish nationality. Jewish nationality is restricted to those qualifying under the 1950 law of return and its specific amendments relating to Jews immigrating into Israel. The 1952 law is a citizenship, not a nationality law, as it defines who can obtain citizenship in Israel. These two laws set up a two-tiered system, one for Jews who are nationals of Israel and can automatically become citizens, a second for non-Jews who can become citizens but never can become nationals of Israel. As an international law matter, Israel could not define as its nationals persons who were nationals of other states with no connection to the territory, particularly if doing so did not require the specific consent of the individual foreign nationals and their states. A state cannot simply confer its nationality on persons of foreign nationality living in other states absent a close connection between the person and that state, even if that person accepts the status. So the Israeli laws repealing the Palestine citizenship law and replacing it with one that denationalized the vast majority of Palestinians in 1950-1952 violate two fundamental customary law principles. First, that all habitual residents of the territory of a state which succeeds another must be granted citizenship in the new state. And second, that no state can arbitrarily denationalize habitual residents of that state on the basis of protected grounds, such as race, religion, ethnic, or national origin. What that means is that if Palestinian nationality remained intact from 1924, because Israel's denationalization was void from an international law perspective, then all Palestinians recognized under that nationality law and their descendants have the right to claim nationality tied to the territory covered by British mandate, dating back to the time of such recognition. Palestinian refugees and Palestinians claiming nationality dating from 1924 and through subsequent generations have an absolute right as nationals to return to their place of origin. The main conclusion from viewing the refugee issue through the lens of nationality law is that the strongest basis for Palestinian right of return is as nationals of Palestine, not just as refugees or as stateless persons. Moreover, being granted citizenship in other countries does not negate Palestinians' rights as nationals to return to their precise homes, a legal fact reinforced by customary international law, treaty law, UN resolutions, and international jurisprudence. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everyone, for highly interesting contributions and insights into a very complex question, the question of Palestine. Leila's contribution on the politics, Adam's on the political economy, and Susan's on the legal is extremely valuable in terms of adding to our knowledge and furthering the debate. I do have a question that I will put forward to all the panelists to kickstart the discussion. But I'd like to remind everyone, if you have any questions, points of argument you want to send to either panelist, please use the question and answer box. You should send it to all panelists so that it shows to everyone, and then I can moderate the questions. So to kickstart the debate on all these issues of partition versus a new way forward, I will pose the question regarding the issue of moving away from partition as a model, this model that has been factualized on the ground now through agreements, through facts on the ground. Moving away from this model, be it legally or politically, into or towards a decolonizing mindset in framing our understanding of the Palestinian question. How does the focus on indigeneity as the indigenous people's right to decolonize Israel from within. How this focus on indigeneity manifests itself in your respective contributions. Leila, do you want to start?
Yeah, thank you very much for this very good, important question, and for all the panelists. I think indigeneity is at the heart of all what we're talking about. You know, when you talk about indigenous people's right to the land, we're talking about decolonization. Now, I think, as you know, the indigeneity now has got a revival over the past few years as a counter argument to settler colonialism, as giving agency to the indigenous to claiming their rights. I think indigenous rights and right to the land is central to any process of decolonization, because you're trying to reclaim justice, and you're trying to reclaim your ownership of the land. The question is how do you decolonize from within? And I think you pointed out any one-state solution is really based on a decolonization from within Israel, because it starts from the argument that we are living in a one-state reality. So stop telling us that we have two states. We are living in one-state reality where the only sovereign is Israel on the land between the river and the sea. And this Israel is the only sovereign, have fragmented the Palestinian into 3, if not more, 4 legal orders. One in Gaza under siege, or in Ramallah, a little bit of West Bank, a little bit of rights. Those citizens of Israel who have more rights but are still second-rate citizens, and the refugees without rights. So the fact that it is now shown that the two-state solution is dead, we are in a one-state reality. How do we change this one-state reality into a reality of equality and protect indigenous rights? And I think it starts by emphasizing this discourse of we are in a one-state apartheid reality, that decolonization, indigeneity is a right protected by international law, that the Palestinian struggle is an indigenous struggle, is not a struggle of just equality, just, you know, show off like each one gets his states and then everybody is happy ever after. I see it more in that respect, how you're going to tie decolonizing relationship and land with affirming indigenous rights. I hope this, you know, an attempt of an answer.
Thank you, Leila. Adam, do you want to comment?
Yes, thank you, Samia, for that great question. And I mean, I agree with Leila's key points there. The other aspect, or two other points I would add to what Leila just said. Firstly, I think placing Palestine in the regional context, it's really important in working against this kind of partitioning of Palestine to realize that the Palestinian people aren't simply those in either the West Bank and Gaza Strip, or increasingly just in the West Bank, as it's often been framed. Working against that fragmentation of Palestine also means incorporating, in particular, I think, refugees and the Palestinian diaspora into the conversation about liberation, the conversation about decolonization, and the conversation about the types of strategies that we need to move forward. I think one of the pernicious effects of the Oslo Accords was narrowing the Palestinian vision down to these tiny slithers of land in the West Bank and Gaza, and I think really reclaiming the spirit of the Palestinian struggle means to look beyond, or means to incorporate the whole of the Palestinian people in this conversation. So that's the first thing I would say, that rejecting partition means looking at the whole of the population, refugees, and also Palestinians from 1948. I think a really important part of that too. The second thing I would say, related to what I said in my presentation, is the need to look, I think, at the regional order, and in particular the very negative role played by regional states, particularly in the Gulf, increasingly towards the Palestinian liberation. So I think when we're talking about decolonization and moving forward, it's not just simply a question of what goes on in the territorial borders of 1948 Palestine or the area of historic Palestine. It's also about the wider regional struggle and transformation of the wider regional scale.
Thank you, Adam. Susan, do you want to make your contribution?
Thank you. Yes, this is a really interesting question, and I'm afraid I take a very different approach from Leila and Adam on this. And the reason is that under the UN's Declaration on Indigenous People, the definition of who is indigenous essentially falls to the people themselves. And here we have a problem with the two narratives of who are the indigenous people. And we don't have a legal framework that says how far you get to go, how far back in history you get to go to decide when you became the indigenous people of that land. The law doesn't help us here. And so I much prefer the legal framework of nationality, because I think it's both clear, and we have from the beginning back, going back to 1924, we have the international community's view very well established about who are the nationals of Palestine. In other words, there has never been a recognition from a legal point of view of the Jewish people as a nationality concept that grants self-determination rights. In fact, the law will never recognize people on the basis of a religion alone to be able to decide that they are nationals. In fact, it's the antithesis of what international law has decided is the basis of nationality. So I would push back against a framework of indigenous rights and come back to the very clear legal framework of national rights.
Thank you. That gives a lot of issues for thought, actually, having different perspectives. Let me just check the question and answer part. I have a question for Adam. How far can we rely on private capital flows and the Palestinian capitalist class to further aspirations for liberation beyond local development? And do we have other historical examples of such role or contributions elsewhere?
Thank you for
It's
that.
for you, Adam.
Yes, thank you, Hassan, for that question. I mean, I think, and this is the argument that I make in my chapter, is that actually we cannot rely on the Palestinian capitalist class in terms of aspirations for liberation. I think the impact of that class, particularly the diaspora class that I spoke about in my presentation, has been very negative in terms of the Palestinian movement and in terms, in fact, of local development. I think one of the clear trends, and this is something I'm sure Samia can speak to much better than I can, but one of the clear trends over the last couple of decades has been worsening inequalities in the Palestinian territories, the polarization of wealth, and this, I think, is very wholly negative towards our ability to resist and our ability to move forward. So, and I think this is not simply this observation about this the negative role of Palestinian capital, at least the leading segments of Palestinian capital, is not something solely true in the case of the Palestinian struggle. I think it's clear in other liberation struggles in South Africa, for example. I think we see we can make a similar conclusion. So I really think that part of building a different way forward is addressing these questions of inequality, political economy, class structure in real ways, which I think in earlier moments of the Palestinian struggle was actually done in a much better way.
Can I say
something
to that? Because
go on, Leila.
I liked it. It's a very good question. I think we cannot bypass also the historical period we are in. I mean, as Adam mentioned at the end of his intervention, actually private capital was very important for Palestinian nationalism if we look at the 1920s and 30s. You know, the book of Shireen Sayyali and other capital was very important, but it was a national capital. It was invested in building, decolonizing from the British, from the Zionists, to create a strong nation state. And I think that the whole Middle East region, I mean, many would argue, private capital has been very central to national development in other countries, if you take Asia, also with the role of the state. The question is why in the Middle East it failed so miserably, not just at the level of the Palestinians, but also at the level of many, non-Gulf states. So that historical juncture, I think, is very important. And the question that, given that we're still talking about a neoliberal system of economic management, and the pandemic had gave it really a real crisis, do we have a window now that we can get rid of this neoliberal, privatized logic of development, which is inegalitarian? And is there a scope now for the state or for private citizens to remind the state of the responsibility towards the citizens and establish a more equitable, accountable system? I don't know, how far we have that opportunity, because so long as you have strong capital that is not interested and not seeing the point of better income distribution, we might just stay where we are. And Israel definitely, with regards to the Palestinians, is very much interested in the fragmentation of this reality. So private capital doesn't have in the short run any prospects for growth. The question, will there be an intervention by the state, by other states, to make it more profitable, more engaged for national development or not?
Indeed. I mean, private capital can actually play a counterpart in the sense that, a counter role, in the sense that it actually colludes with colonialism, elements of colonialism to further colonialism rather than liberation. So private capital can be part of the problem rather than the solution. Anyway, we now go to a different area with another question regarding Russia's involvement. Is there any chances in the near future, any of you may think, for Russia to play a role in the apartheid imposed by Israel on Palestine? So do we see Russia as playing a role, being in aid of resistance, etc.? What are your views on this issue, the panelists?
Adam or Susan, do you want to give it a try? Or do you want me to take the bullet for that?
Susan, what do you think, Susan?
I'm not an expert on Russia's relationship with Palestine, Israel at this point, but my guess is that Russia is not going to intervene in the near future, that Russia has its plate full in terms of its own borders and the massive dispute with the NATO powers. And I just don't see that Russia is going to take a stand. But that's my uneducated view.
No,
Just to add on to that, I agree with. Sorry, go ahead, Leila.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think also in recent years that that Russia and Israel have actually moved closer together in terms of their being on the same side in terms of a number of major questions, particularly around kind of military and security links. So I don't think that Russia is going to be playing a positive role in this respect.
Yeah, and this ties also with the question we see it, like every authoritarian regime, if you look globally, is not going to come to the intervention and the aid of the Palestinian, because as a whole, I mean, once we centralize private capital in this, in this very elitist way, there is no regional interest and no national interest for Russia or China. I mean, for me, the core question would be: is China going to be more of an arbitrator moving forward? That's what the U.S. has been talking about. What in U.S. press has been talking about is how much the fact that the U.S. is retreating from the region, from the Middle East, including from Palestine, Israel. Will it be China intervening to calm things down or find a solution, or And there I see, comes back to Adam's point about regional power, I mean, and political economic consideration, you know, what does Palestine mean to China compared to the oil in the Gulf or gas in the Gulf? So I think we go back to the geostrategic and political economic consideration to impact who's going to intervene in Palestine. And I really think moving forward, we are at such a point regionally and globally of contrast between authoritarian regimes of various types and individual rights where people are rebelling but not having the means to succeed against authoritarian regime. That the future of Palestine is tied with the future of liberatory politics regionally and globally. I can't see any other way.
Thank you. I have a question here on the role of refugees and the right of return in particular in the struggle for decolonizing Palestine. What would it mean to center Palestinian refugees politically and epistemologically? What do you think would it mean to have the Palestinian refugee question be centered politically and epistemologically?
So maybe I can start.
Please, Susan, thank you.
Yes, I mean, for almost 3 decades, I've been advocating for putting the refugee question and the nationality question front and center. It seems to me that the key to solving the Israel-Palestine issue is the refugees. And that's why all negotiations up until Taba precluded reference to Resolution 194, a very deliberate strategy on Israel's part to ensure that Resolution 194 was never included in the negotiations, referred to in any of the documents. And that taboo was broken in Taba for the first time. A kind of bastard version, if you will, of 194 was included in the two proposals that were on the table. But of course, since 194 is the core of the individual rights of Palestinian refugees, the main issue has been to ensure that that was not part of the discussions. And as you all know, in Oslo, the refugee question was postponed to final status, and final status has never come. So absolutely, the interesting thing about the refugee and Palestinians as nationals lens is that it's irrelevant what the ultimate statehood decisions are in terms of the rights of the Palestinians to return, to restitution of property, to compensation for losses. And if those are the central questions and put at the top of the agenda, the entire framework of discussion changes. So I absolutely would 100% say that the focus needs to be on refugees and Palestinians as nationals.
Thank you, Susan. Adam or Leila, would you like to add?
I would just say I agree with Susan's comments, and I think it's very clear that particularly the post-Oslo fragmentation and narrowing of Palestine that I spoke to earlier has primarily involved trying to relegate or push away the refugee struggle. So I again agree that centering Palestinian refugees is really, I think, key to any kind of political renewal at this moment.
I want both to add to this. I agree with you, but I also want to push back because of a number of, I mean, the Palestinian question is the issue of the right of return. You know, it has always the essence of the Palestine question is people expelled from their land, and the refugee question is central to that. I think what the Palestinian national struggle has been struggling with is how do you ensure this right of return? And the idea was you ensure this right of return by claiming a state. We tried it, now we realized that a state cannot help it because we did not tackle Zionism. But But moving forward, how do you protect the right of returns? There's the individual right that you mentioned, Susan, which is very true. But if we focus just on the individual rights, I mean, there is something very liberating in it, but it doesn't solve, in my view, how you're going to protect this right of return. Okay, you protect how you're going to implement it, this right of return. I think the implementation of right of return cannot be abstracted from what kind of state you're going to create. Not because I'm questioning this right. No, everybody has a right to come back. But I'm also realizing that now, 70 years after the Nakba, 75 years after the Nakba, the relation to Palestine from the diaspora or those who are refugee is very different and changed. This doesn't mean it takes away the rights. I'm totally, don't get me wrong, that question, I'm trying to understand how the right of return can be protected without just limiting it as an individual right. Does it need to be tied to statehood or not? Now, my understanding of your work, Susan, is that it's not tied to statehood. It's just people can go, anybody can go to Palestine, even if it is not Israel. So the question is, do we give up, if Israel were today to say every Palestinian can go back, but it still remains Israel, would we accept it as Palestinians? You see what I'm trying to say? Because I think there is this challenge between how do we go back home and how do we live back home? And the meaning of home has changed over the past 70 years, whether we like it or not. So I think there's a tension. It's a protected right, and it should be, and it's the essence of the Palestinian struggle. The question of how to fulfill it politically is still with us problematic, and it applies also, for example, to Syria or Iraq or whatever, you name it, all the refugees all over the world. They have an individual right to go back home, but how are you going to guarantee this? How are you going to guarantee that in the state that you're living? I mean, we go back to needing to have a democratic, fair state, but how will we establish that? Just being the devil's advocate.
Thank you for answering this question very interestingly. I just have an informational question from one of the audience asking about capital inflows into Palestine. The question just asks about, apart from capital investment by diaspora, what other sources are there of capital inflows to Palestine? So it's an informational question asking about capital inflows. What are the sources of capital inflows into Palestine?
I could have my comment on Samia. I mean, I think it's really important here to understand the role of donor funding in Palestine. The fact that again, this is a feature, I think, of the Oslo Accords and the way the Palestinian Authority was formed, that a very deep reliance on external flows from European Union, the United States, and other donors, including from the Gulf, state bilateral donations, as well as NGO and international agency funds, which again has served to, I think, tie Palestinian political choices or the Palestinian political authority and the kinds of political choices that the PA might be able to make, because they are so dependent upon these external capital flows. The other aspect to Oslo, of course, that's really important here is, has become much more important, I think, more recently, is the way that Israel has deducts a certain proportion of money that comes in through imports into the West Bank through Israel, and through the control over dispersing that money that's actually owed to the PA, again, is able to very much dictate the kind of political options or political choices of the PA. So I think all of these kinds of external flows really do play a very important political role in Palestine.
Thank you. Would you like to add, Leila, anything? I think another source, which is not really inflows, but it's a source of resources for the West Bank in particular, it's workers in Israel. Workers in Israel constitute a major contribution. The resources generated there by Palestinians, nearly 250,000 Palestinians work inside the Israeli economy, and the transfers from their work into the Palestinian economy is quite substantial. It's one of the most important contributions. And of course, Palestinians are only allowed to work in non-skilled labor. So it's agricultural sector, construction, and very simple types of services and manufacturing. So these are the capital inflows coming into the West Bank and Gaza. And as you can see from what Adam explained, the economy is actually highly dependent on these inflows, and hence Israel and in the international community uses these to dictate their political will on the Palestinians. And that's also another predicament for the struggle of the Palestinians. I don't have any more questions from the audience, but I'd like to thank everyone very much for this very interesting panel. I would encourage everyone to read the book. Has it been launched, Leila? It has. So it should
put it in the chat.
basically. Sorry, go ahead.
I'll put it in the chat.
Mm-hmm. And it adds to our knowledge, I think, because it actually provides something for the future, something to actually work with, to look into, to build on. And that's for us as academics, our basically our contribution to not just knowledge, but to decolonization and resistance. So thank you everyone for an excellent panel, and thank you for this very interesting conference. And now I hand over to Dr. Hanieh for the closing remarks for the conference.
Thank you very much. It's been fascinating listening to this panel, as well as the other ones, of course, over the last 2 days. Let me just say very briefly, relating to this panel, it's great to be united with some very old friends. I want to congratulate Leila for her new book. I think we've reversed roles. I used to give her things to read. Now she's given me ideas to learn and pick up on some new ideas from her book, which I am eager to read. So congratulations for that. And also an excellent panel, which have really provided us with very complementary perspectives on this vexed issue that is, in my view, at the heart of Middle East and Middle East studies. So I think it's a pertinent moment to conclude our conference with this panel. And in fact, thinking about the theme of the conference, it's probably very difficult to find a better topic that addresses issues relating to knowledge and power asymmetry in relation to Middle East studies. So if we have contributed to maintaining Palestine studies alive, we are very happy. I can say with pride that when I was in SOAS, and Adam can attest to this, one of our points of pride was that we set up a Center for Palestine Studies, which continues to be very active, and in which Adam also was very, very active. So the struggle continues. I think this is something that is at the heart of instability in our region, and to the extent that we are focused on this issue in our scholarly pursuits, in our academic exchanges, I think we are definitely doing the right thing. So a big thank you to this panel for enlightening us. I learned a lot, and I have to really read Leila's book and the various chapters in there. So Susan, thank you. Your legal perspective was really refreshing for an economist who doesn't have much to do with law. It's very, very informative. But I mean, the sad thing is, you know, we're dealing with a context in which international law has been flouted left, right, and center. So it's sometimes difficult to remain hopeful on this note. Nevertheless, it's pertinent. We hear from subject experts like yourself. So you have really shed an important light on this particular debate. Okay, well, all good things end, and this is no exception. For the last 2 days, we've had an incredible journey, an intellectual, academic, and scholarly journey that, of course, for us, for the organizing team, started well before yesterday. I am in a young and very dynamic academic department here in Doha, the Middle Eastern Studies Department. Those of you who have joined our panels will have met every single colleague of mine and faculty member who have been a very, very important part of the process that discussed, conceived, organized, and ultimately delivered the various different sessions of the conference. So I want to thank my colleagues who on the organizing committee were very generous with their ideas, with their efforts, with their energies. And this has been also a very, really good bonding exercise between us. It is our first international conference. I hope it will be continuing in the future. Plans are for biennial, so every 2 years. In fact, the very first one we originally planned, which would have been in person, April 2020, fell victim to COVID, and since then the world has changed. So it goes without saying that I look forward to an opportunity to meet with every one of you in person in Doha in future occasions. So thank you very much. Let me also thank other panelists, other contributors. One particular thing that I want to acknowledge outright is the extent to which all panelists really readily and willingly engaged with our theme. I mentioned in my introductory remarks yesterday that our theme, Knowledge and Power in Middle East Studies, International and Regional Perspectives, reveals a degree of very healthy tension we encounter with our subject. And this is why every one of the 4 sessions we had, as well as, of course, the initial keynote speech, addressed this question from different angles and perspectives. Professor Crady gave us much food for thought, encouraging us to re-examine Middle East studies beyond looking at the Middle East as a geographical locus, but broaden and deepen the depth of our vision to incorporate the global South. I think there's a lot in there that needs to be instilled and to be questioned and to be digested. And for us, that is a very interesting, challenging, and thought-provoking approach. Our next session yesterday directly engaged with questions of power and power distribution, both at international and regional levels, but also looking at the way in which interstate rivalry and transnational movements have impacted on the politics of the region. The second session in the afternoon then addressed the question of knowledge production and particularly the application of new digital technologies, the so-called digital humanities, and how they can contribute to furthering our understanding and study of humanities at large, but particularly in relation to Middle East studies. And here we had some really fascinating case studies and findings in relation to how news outlets and news channels oscillate and fluctuate in relation to particular political crisis or episodes. One case study was in relation to Israel-Palestine conflict. Another one was an examination of as many as 2 billion tweets relating to COVID across the globe and multilingual. It's a phenomenal empirical study, and one that obviously cannot and could not be fit in a 15 minutes presentation, but I'm just giving an acknowledgement of the depth and breadth of the coverage of some of the topics. And of course, today, we then picked up another critical component of power asymmetry, and that of gender, which is very much etched into the intellectual character of our department. We have a program in women studies, women's society and development. And Dr. Dana, Dr. Carol, and Dr. Sophie, who presided on our 2 sessions today, are very much part of that. And this particular session took a very interesting and refreshing perspective on gender dynamics in relation to cities and space. So for me as an economist, I've always believed in the importance of geography. And I was very pleased to see geography in a particular sense reinstated into Middle East studies. Anyhow, I thank every one of our contributors, panelists, for their very informative, educational, thoughtful, and engaging contributions. I hope we stay in touch. I'm very pleased to say that this family of scholars battling with different and challenging ideas relating to what we call Middle East studies, and we shall continue, by the way, to call it Middle East studies for for a long time to come. We have no plans to change, despite all the downsides that have been alluded to in the past two days. I hope we stay in touch, and I hope there will be other opportunities for furthering our engagements. I want to thank our students. I know the students in our college were asked to join us, and some of them have been active in fielding questions, and I'm sure they have not been disappointed by the quality of the offerings and the environment, the ambience in which these exchanges have taken place. And last but not least, I want to acknowledge the team that has been behind the organization and the administration, and of course, taking care of the technical aspects of the conference. And that takes me on to a special mention of the conference administrator, my colleague Charlene Domingo. She's somewhere there. You can't see her, but you have probably received some emails from her. She has been diligently and very efficiently dealing with inquiries over the past few months. And of course, our comms team, the name Mohammed Amin is now, I trust, a very famous name across the globe. He is the force behind the screen that we are looking at. He has made sure everything has been running smoothly and very punctually across this platform that we use. And he's done this with great efficacy and efficiency. And I want to really thank him for his contribution. Other colleagues in our comms team, Nupal Thani and Riman Bustami, and I suffice mentioning only 2 of them, have worked tirelessly over the last few months, often having to put up with my restless, incessant demands, but always with good humor, with patience, with efficiency, and a degree of pleasantness that makes working with them always very enjoyable. So it is now coming up to 7:30 Doha time. In Boston, I suspect this is approaching early afternoon. We are working across different time zones, naturally. And in fact, tomorrow here in Doha, it's a national holiday. It's the National Sports Day. So we will have a chance to hopefully engage in some more physical activity beyond sitting at our computers and staring at the screens and listening to some fascinating contributions. And the last word from me, and I promise to stop on this note, our special thanks to our Dean, Dr. Amal Al-Malki, who was with us in the opening session. She moderated the keynote speech with Dr. Crady. And she is, as I said in my introduction, a visionary, leader. She is extremely energetic and someone who must take credit for bringing together a fantastic team and creating an environment in which we all feel we are contributing to a very worthwhile cause. So with all that, thank you again. All the best. The session will end with Amin showing some basic information about our various teaching programs. Of course, you can log out if you're not thinking of applying for one of these programs. If you happen to be interested and curious about finding out about a little bit more about what we do and who we are, this information will appear on the screen. And other than that, good night and all the best. Thank you.
Thank you
and
so
bye.
much.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very
everyone.
much. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.